Okay, so let's discuss the abolition movement, abolitionism, however you want to look at it. Now, the anti-slavery sentiment developed. Um, well, there's a long history. We're going to get to some examples here, but it really began to develop in the 1770s as political consciousness began to rise. Part of this was due to the revolutionary generation of Americans themselves, who began to propagate the core ideals of the Enlightenment, the worth of the individual, freedom, equality, democracy. Abolitionism grew in Europe around the same time as it would in the colonies, mostly in England. Initially, the goal of abolitionists was gradualism, first attempting to shut down the slave trade, then to end the institution altogether. And the key part of this term, of course, is gradual. It was a slow plan. Now, officially, the U.S. would end the slave trade in 1808. But court cases in England toward the end of the 18th century would offer plenty of support for this, and slavery was increasingly marginalized in the British Empire. The British would also, quote unquote, support abolition in the colonies in some ways. During the Revolution, for example, Governor of Virginia John Murray declared that slaves who fought for the British would be freed. Now, this was about taking an advantage in the war, obviously. It was not about morality. But many slaves did escape their plantations. Most were recaptured by the end of the war. Still, around 14,000 former slaves found their freedom during this time. Now, during this general time frame, we see other efforts made, which happened simultaneously to what was going on in England with its Committee on the Slave Trade, later the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. In 1773, slaves themselves in Massachusetts petitioned the General Court for emancipation. In other areas, less formal actions reflected a growing awareness of bondage and its contrast to the freedom sought by colonists. Whites, too, recognized the irony of a group of colonies seeking freedom while still enslaving an entire population, or most of an entire population, I should say. Quakers would help to lead this charge as early as 1688. Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania, protested slavery in a resolution that condemned, quote, the traffic of men body. By the 1770s, there was a complete abolitionist movement in Pennsylvania, which, of course, is the original home to the Quakers. In 1775, we have the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. By 1784, we have the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of sorry, the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, or the Abolition Society for short. I prefer that. Some of these titles are quite long. This was made up of artisans and shopkeepers, standard middle class Americans, and would later add heroes such as Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush. They worked in the courts to help those unlawfully enslaved and pushed for outright abolition, including petitioning the Constitutional Convention to ban the slave trade. We talked about the problems with that before. And even though they would push for abolition, again, this was very much a gradualist effort. For the most part, these early efforts were about slow, gradual change. In 1776, Quakers would ban members who had slaves. Congregationalists also pushed for abolition, along with the Quakers, and evangelicals' upsurge also contributed to the rising anti-slavery sentiment. Again, we're talking about the 1770s, the end of the 18th century here, before, during, and after the Revolution. These Christians recognized that all were equal in God's eyes and recognized the hypocrisy of slavery, especially in a nation they believed was part of a mission from God. The more you know, of course, about early American history, about early colonial history, John Winthrop, his idea of a city upon a hill. Again, that we were on a mission from God to create progress that the rest of the world could emulate. And of course, there's some hypocrisy with this. Slavery went against their Christian values, and slaves were welcomed into these churches. Now, it is noteworthy, of course, some earlier would use Christianity or religion to help justify the use of slavery. But make no mistake, Christianity is at the core of the abolition movement, both in Europe and in the colonies and in the United States. And again, we mentioned the gradualism. For some, this was about, hey, purchasing freedom for slaves. Maybe there'd be money, and we're going to get to this with some of the organizations. But there were many different ways to end slavery. And early on, much of it had to do with compensating slave owners. This would change, and we'll get to that. In 1775, one Connecticut author asked, quote, "How can we expect our endeavors at the court of Great Britain should be blessed when we are acting a more cruel part with our neighbors, the blacks?" So again, even during this revolutionary time, there's recognition that, hey, we are pushing for our own freedom and democracy and equality while denying those to an entire race. Note in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson talks about being enslaved by the British tyrant. He calls for universal equality. His calls for universal equality thus rang hollow among many, including the founders. Jefferson wanted to include a codicil in the Declaration of Independence, which called for an end to slavery. This was denied. And of course, we know that Jefferson himself did not treat slaves well and held on to them. Even after he died, he did not free them. But we'll get to a little bit more of that. Tom Paine, of course, one of the true intellectual fathers of the Americans. He was the author of Common Sense, as well as many other important works that would help to foster revolutionary sentiment. He mused in 1775, quote, "How can Americans complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them while they hold so many hundreds of thousands in slavery?" So again, some slave owners even recognize this hypocrisy, and they would echo Paine's sentiments, going so far as to either free their slaves or allow them, again, to purchase their freedom. This happened most often in areas with smaller numbers of slaves. But one of the reasons I bring this up is because there was recognition that slavery was immoral, that it was wrong. Too often we kind of have this general overview that, oh my gosh, nobody realized that slavery was bad. Plenty of people did. Now, this does not make, obviously, the institution itself okay. This does not mean that we could not have ended it sooner, but it is important to recognize there were many voices that were against slavery, even some who practiced slavery. Now, after the Revolution, anti-slavery sentiment, or abolitionism, began to grow even stronger among whites. By the end of the Revolution, only Georgia and South Carolina continued to allow the importation of slaves. Massachusetts had specifically prohibited it altogether, and we discussed Pennsylvania's well-intentioned but slow attempt at abolition. In the mid-1780s, most states had active anti-slavery societies, even in the South. In 1790, Connecticut, we see the creation of the Connecticut Society for the Promotion of Freedom and the Relief of Persons Unlawfully Holden in Bondage. This group, too, assisted in court cases and provided protection as many young free blacks would be kidnapped and enslaved. Certainly you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. You're probably familiar with that. In New York, the New York Manumission Society helped to protect free African Americans. In one example, Madame Vollenbrun, a slave-owning refugee from Santo Domingo, or Saint-Domingue, didn't pronounce that correctly. Anybody who knows French, please forgive me. She took up residence in New York City, where she planned to transfer her slaves from eventual freedom in New York to slavery in Virginia. Now, the New York Manumission Society claimed the slaves had been freed by French emancipation in 1794. Activists surrounded the home of Vollenbrun, as did many African Americans. Threats of burning down the house were made. The city guard had to come in and disperse people. Eventually, the slaves would be sent to Maryland. Now, we're going to get to Santo Domingo and Haiti. We're going to touch upon that here in a little bit. Of course, there are many nuances regarding French ownership of Santo Domingo, how slavery was ended, then Napoleon tried to bring it back, yada, yada, yada. But again, we'll touch upon the Haitian Revolution here in a little bit. Some parts of this nation took measures to actually foster liberty. They didn't just create societies and make documents and stuff. In 1780, Pennsylvania legislated a gradual emancipation. Now, this was great in theory, but in reality, it was not an immediate end, and there were some loopholes. Only slaves born after the law was enacted were eligible, and they could not expect to receive their freedom until they had served a 28-year term of indenture. Thus, if you were born in 1780, a slave could not enjoy freedom until at least 1808. Many were held even longer. And again, if you were born in 1779, 1 year before this came out, sorry, you were born too soon. But even so, again, think of the 28 years of indenture. Now, by controlling slave children, slaveholders could also dominate the parents, sometimes forcing them to sign long-term contracts in order to have visitation with their children. So maybe you fall under this, and oh my gosh, you can be freed in 1808, but you had a child. That child is then in bondage. You're not going to leave the child. Again, there are many loopholes here. is a gradualist attempt, but a weak attempt. In 1780, when Pennsylvania did initiate this legislation, other northern states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, or even the largest northern state, New York, or the largest northern slave state, New York, the liquidation of slavery had not even begun. This was progress, but not much. By 1804, all northern states but Delaware had committed themselves to a slow end of slavery via similar methods. Now, states were taking legal action to change the institution of slavery, and many believed that slavery would begin to fade out on its own. Slavery was important for labor-intensive agriculture, we talked about in the previous lecture, and the South was becoming a single crop system focusing on cotton. But remember, the time involved in picking the seeds from the compact bolls in short staple cotton rendered its cultivation unprofitable. Even though cotton was seen as a potential savior of the South's economy, this issue rendered it less and less viable. But technology reared its head, and in 1793, Eli Whitney perfected the cotton gin. In the South, slaves were an integral part of society and economy. As Berlin has stated, we discussed him before, the South was a slave society. Southerners, for the most part, doubled down as the argument over slavery began to grow. They held tighter control over their slaves, punished them more harshly if they tried to leave, and ignored any claims to call for the institution's end. That said, some manumission in the Upper South did occur. Free black communities grew in both Maryland and Virginia after the Revolution, and planters debated the practical benefits of slave labor in a supposedly free republic. Now, there's also the issue of free labor and how important that is. Eric Foner, Foner, one of the leading scholars, well, the leading scholar of Reconstruction and a scholar of this era, discusses the issue of free labor and how this was recognized as superior to slave labor, even beyond the bondage. But so again, we have these free black communities developing. We have some questioning the practical benefits of the institution itself, but of course, not all agreed. We know George Washington freed his slaves upon his death. Thomas Jefferson did not. Patrick Henry, one of the strongest and most charismatic voices for liberty, would also hold on to his and would keep them in bondage even after his death. In 1807, Congress voted to permanently outlaw the importation of slaves. In the following year, little debate was raised. So by 1808, the slave trade itself ends. We have discussed the role of Christianity in abolitionism, but other than ministers, the abolition movement had many proponents. One was William Lloyd Garrison, who founded the Liberator in 1831. This was the first prominent anti-slavery newspaper. He founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society the following year in 1832, and a year after that would create the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, these societies, as I had intimated earlier, had existed since the mid-1700s, but Garrison's societies were much more radical. Earlier groups had called for the gradual end of slavery, helped raise money so slaves could purchase their freedom, talked about compensation for slave owners. Garrison and his followers called for an absolute and immediate end to slavery, with no compensation for slave owners. Now, for these folks, there was to be no compromise. Garrison eschewed politics because he believed it was about compromise, and definitely it was. He did not want any compromise on this issue. Now, the Liberty Party would form in 1840. Of course, it has a limited time frame. The Republican Party was developed to end slavery. We'll get more to that here in a couple weeks. Garrison was loud and vociferous. He was not too popular. For example, he was dragged through the streets of Boston and almost killed. He had a bounty on his head of $4,000. He would even call for the North to secede from the Union. Again, Garrison, strong leader, vociferous. And this gets back to something that I had mentioned earlier, this myth that it's like North versus South, that it's just that easy. You can see even in Boston, which is really the epicenter of the abolitionist movement, he had a bounty on his head and he was dragged through the streets, almost killed. So, again, it's not as easy as we often pretend it was. And abolitionism was definitely spreading. In 1836, there were so many petitions to end slavery that Congress passed a gag rule automatically tabling any discussion of it. King Andrew Jackson, also forbade postal carriers from delivering abolitionist literature in the South. I laugh because we often, Jackson, he's this populist. He cared about the people. No, he cared about his power. He cared about maintaining his own influence, if you will, even beyond his presidency. And again, denying the dispersal or the dissemination of such literature goes against, I don't know how many of our Bill of Rights, but so you have people like Jackson who's definitely prevented much progress. But again, there is some progress. There are efforts, and it's also important to note that I mean, there are many other important leaders in abolition, but women played a key role in this movement, and their experience would help to forge the early women's movement. Much like the civil rights movement would spur feminism over a century later, women were involved in abolitionism. Included in this group were folks like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Grimke sisters. And in fact, I mean, the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first convention or the first large get together of women seeking women's rights in particular. This actually came about because leaders of this movement were denied entry onto the floor of the anti-slavery convention in England. So it was recognition of they're not treated well, but you know what? We're not treated well either. So women, again, very much, even though they play such a large role in reform movements in the 19th century, they are very much front and center when it comes to abolitionism. Beyond these societies, beyond women, slaves, of course, did not sit meekly by. The revolutionary generations came of age, dissent grew. More slaves simply ran away to try to find freedom, leading to the fugitive slave law. We'll discuss that in full when we talk about the run-up to the Civil War. Other slaves worked slower in an attempt to make their work less efficient. Sometimes they broke their tools or lost them so that they did not have to use them. Some talked back, some became violent. Many slaves were not passive. They were active in their efforts to gain liberation. Again, this is one of the key points that Berlin points out. But they ran away in droves, following the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada or other northern states. They fled to Native American communities as well, joined them in wars. Some would even poison their masters. So African Americans were not bystanders. Free blacks worked toward abolition as well. Some slaves would create whatever havoc may work toward their freedom. A few major slave revolts in the 19th century offer examples of this pushback. We're going to get to those in a minute. Though there were countless such insurrections dating back to the 17th century, and one could certainly provide, I mean, there are many books on these insurrections and how numerous they truly were. Now, getting back to one of these societies, the 1787, and again, this gets to African American agency. The Free African Society was founded by Richard Allen, who was a freed slave. This group held religious services. They offered mutual aid for, quote, free Africans and their descendants. The main goal to assist newly freed blacks so that they could strengthen their community, develop leaders, assimilate to society, and also it was again to protect those who were free and help prevent them from being kidnapped. Or even helping to purchase freedom. Free blacks did not live much differently than slaves. They faced many restrictions as well. Their movement was limited. They did not receive full protection under the law. In Petersburg, Virginia, for example, free black Esther Fells irritated her white neighbor, who would then whip her for disturbing the peace. The sheriff came and arrested Esther Fells, not the neighbor, and ordered 15 more lashes, quote, for being insolent to a white person. So, again, even if you were free, it's not like you were free. It's not like you were treated as an equal. There were some opportunities as apprentices, seamstresses, cooks, in service, and a few as teachers, but generally, again, they are restricted. As slavery became more important to the Southern economy, insurrections would increase, which I had mentioned earlier. Fear, and this would lead to more fear among slaveholders. Southern states wrote increasingly harsh slave codes during the 19th century, which gave slave owners virtual life and death control over their slaves. Now, how did these come about? I'm going to touch upon three somewhat famous rebellions very briefly. Gabriel's Rebellion of 1800, which occurred, kind of upset a delicate balance in Virginia. But this came about, I had mentioned earlier, the Haitian Revolution. Now, the Haitian Revolution was the first successful slave rebellion in the New World, however you want to look at it. And when the Haitian Revolution occurred, these slaves, ex-slaves, etc., won their independence from the French. This set a standard for many. Gabriel recognized this. He wanted to continue this. Those involved in his revolt marched under a banner which read "Death or Liberty." Weather got in the way, a torrential rain hit, would cause dissent, disorganization. Ultimately, 27 of the rebels would be hanged publicly. Denmark Vesey in 1822, Vesey. He was a carpenter in Charleston. He had bought his freedom in 1799, but he, along with the rest of the African American community, faced further discrimination, negative actions, etc. White authorities, pro-slavery elements would harass him and the community over the course of a couple decades, even closing down the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1820. Now, Vesey had helped build this, but more important, this was the center of the community. This is where people came together, worshiped, commingled, talked, etc. And this specific church, very important for the African American community prior to slavery and even after. This is where many ideas for the civil rights would develop later in the 19th century. Vesey organized his rebellion to seize the city of Charleston. The plot was reported to authorities, quashed. 131 free and enslaved blacks were arrested, 72 found guilty, 35 executed. The most famous of slave rebellions, of course, would be that of Nat Turner in 1831. Turner was somewhat of a mystic, was said to have had religious visions up to and including speaking with God. In 1831, Turner claimed one of these visions had spurred him to initiate a slave revolt and organized approximately 70 slaves who went from plantation to plantation, murdering roughly 75 men, women, and children. They gathered more supporters as their rampage continued, but eventually they ran out of ammunition and they were captured. Turner and 18 of his colleagues were hanged. Now, what's the overall result of these actions taken by slaves, by ex-slaves? Unfortunately, it went in the wrong direction. These led to increased protection, further restrictions on slavery. Tighter control became the norm, even though prior to Gabriel's revolution, many states had eased up on slaves and their practices. But after these three, particularly after Turner's actions, those in the South increased slave patrols, they tightened slave codes. Thus, combined with the introduction of the cotton gin, these efforts at rebellion only served to strengthen the institution of slavery, somewhat ironically, and further divide pro and anti-slavery elements in the nation. Now, one of the pro-slavery elements might be the Northern industrial worker. They're in the North. They're white industrial workers. What do they care? Why might some of these workers be against abolition? This is kind of a general pattern we see with anti-illegal immigration or anti-undocumented workers, and with some who are against immigration in general. They feared losing their jobs. They feared competing with this labor and that it may lead their wages to decrease, because if you're an ex-slave, maybe you've been freed, maybe you've earned your freedom, you go to the North, you want to get a job in industry somehow, you might be willing to work for less. And if you work for less, then those who require more or who have been paid more may be eventually let out of their job. So for some of them, this was about solidifying their job security. There's also the Edmund Morgan view, Edmund, M-O-R-G-A-N, Morgan. His classic work, Slavery and Freedom, The American Paradox. Morgan, and this is put very simply, argued the expansion of slavery limited the number of reckless freedmen without property, thus making it more possible for these new freedmen, or the lowest of the working classes of whites, to acquire property, possibly even a slave. Slavery allowed this poorer class a new modicum of status, thereby satiating them in some ways. So Morgan's point here is that by juxtaposing the poor, lower class white worker from the African American slave, the poor, lower class white worker had rights in contrast, had some status in contrast. This then would minimize the opportunity for rebellion against the higher classes, because these poor working class whites still knew, hey, I'm not on the lowest rung of the ladder, so why should I argue? Again, that is oversimplifying really Morgan's argument, but it is an amazing work if you get a chance to read it. Now, I do want to touch upon a few important statistics, and then we'll leave week one alone. I had mentioned in the previous lecture, 10.5 million survived Middle Passage to the New World. About 388,000 of these were shipped directly to North America. Most African slaves were shipped directly to the Caribbean and to South America. Brazil alone received 4.86 million Africans. So not quite half, close to almost half, went straight to Brazil. So again, we focus so much on North American slavery, but slavery indeed was throughout the New World, unfortunately. Some general statistics, and this is according to an analysis of the 1860 census. The previous statistic I provided was from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. 22 Southerners owned 500 or more slaves. Now, when we think of chattel slavery, we think, of course, of large groups of slaves. 22 owned 500 or more. 2,300 owned 100 or more. 10,000 owned 50 or more. 53% of slaveholders owned fewer than 5 slaves. 5% of Southern people owned slaves. Only 20% of families owned slaves. 75% of Southern households owned no slaves. Now keep that in mind as we go through, because again, this shows that things are not as black and white as we might think they are. They're not as cut and dried as some people might claim them to be. Think about that. 3/4 of Southern households had no slaves. And how many people owned slaves? Again, approximately 1/3 of Southern families had slaves. In Mississippi and South Carolina, this number approached about half. There were 385,000 slave owners in the South. This included free African Americans who held slaves. Now, there are many reasons for this. It is not as obvious as, they had slaves so that they could earn more profits. For many of these, you might have a man or a woman who has been able to earn freedom, maybe through purchasing it, and their spouse is still a slave. So they purchase or somehow procure that person as their slave. So officially that might be their slave, but they were not used as slaves. Again, 88% held fewer than 20, roughly 50% had fewer than 5. And again, consider that 75% of Southern households own no slaves. When I say 50% had fewer than 5, I mean 50% of those slaveholders. So even that, though it's a small number of slaves, doesn't make it okay, but it does show that there are some myths about slavery that we need to better understand. So that's it for week 1. Thank you.